All right? With the story in us, I pray, my prayer has been that God would do something with this story in our hearts as a shared story that we know together and are meditating on and saying, what, God, do you have for us here? It's interesting. We live in a society that's pretty open to different belief systems, right? I know a teenager who has moved pretty consistently in and out of identifying as a Wiccan, Muslim, and then Christian, sort of interchangeably back and forth over several years. And often she identifies as one and practices the religion of another. And it's just kind of back and forth. And kind of as a society, right, we generally like to stay open to everything. And so we can have a hard time declaring that any one religion or set of beliefs is wrong, right? While another one is right. Like even for those who make an exclusive claim that Jesus is Lord of all, right? That he is the creator of everything and that there is only one path for salvation and it is found in Jesus. Like we can look at a belief system that it's in total contradiction, that would disagree with those things, this confession of faith, and we can still struggle to say one is right and the other is wrong. Our society encourages us to simply affirm, right, our truth works for us while someone else's truth works for them. That maybe all beliefs are equally valid and true. Like you do you and I'll do me. With all of this shaping the way that we have learned to think sort of in our society, it can be a bit disorienting sometimes to read the Hebrew Bible. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings can then even be like more jolting because we're told the story of king after king described in mostly morally wretched terms, right? This king was a bad dude. And then the king after was a badder dude. And I don't mean badder in like the cool way, but like badder in like the evil way, right? And then this king was the baddest of them all, wicked and vile and evil. But we read kings and we read the summaries of their lives and their badness, it strikes us as like not all that bad. Like, what's the big deal with a king dabbling in some other religions, setting up like a bonus shrine or an extra altar here or there? Like maybe a king added a few statues around in some high places, but like who cares, right? Aren't there more serious things to be concerned about? Our king this morning, Ahab, I mean, this is how he's introduced to us in chapter 16. We get this summary of his life and his reign in chapter 16, verse 30, and this comes before what we just heard. And we hear this. Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of Yahweh, more than all who were before him. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, that's directly from last week, the son of Nebat, Ahab took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. So she's a foreigner. And went and served Baal and worshipped him. And Ahab erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, and he built that which he built in Samaria. And Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke Yahweh, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. And I don't know what you make of this little summary of Ahab, of his life, but to our non-Christian neighbors, this is the kind of passage that only confirms their suspicions, at least on the surface, right? That we are not tolerant of other religions, that maybe we're bigots, that our God is petty. Like, seriously, what's God so angry about? Like, what's the big deal? So Ahab married a foreign wife and built some altars for other gods. Like, what about the real moral issues of our day? If you think that this is like a hypothetical, I've heard this exact set of questions in real conversations with people who don't understand our faith, who don't understand the Hebrew Bible. This all makes Israel's God seem really small to our neighbors. It reminds me a little bit of when I was a kid. I have a parent who, growing up as a kid, had a reputation in our court as being really loud. And a parent who would yell so loud that the kids in our court, and even a couple doors down, could hear it, all of it. So that, like, I would go out and be super embarrassed when I had to go out and play with the neighbor kids, and they would ask what happened this time, and I had to tell them something like, my sisters and I spilled something, or forgot to do some chore, or little things. And the response would be, and that was the reaction, right? Like, my friends would say, like, I legit thought you murdered somebody. This is actually how people often read Kings for the very first time. They encounter God's anger at Israel's idol worship, and they're like, I just don't understand it. This is such a small thing. It just feels way too big a reaction, an angry response, an epic overreaction. But this is where we begin to encounter the wisdom of the book of Kings as part of the Hebrew Bible. After a series of evil kings, summarized, right, as mostly there was this evil king, and then there was also this evil king, and then there was also this evil king. We're then given this extended meditation on King Ahab, this king who did more evil than all of the kings before him. And this more evil draws us in, it piques our interest. But rather than just move on to the next king and just say, well, yeah, Ahab did more stuff, the book of Kings just settles in for a while. And we get to hear and see who this king is and what he's about. We get to see all of Ahab's evil curricular activities. And when the book of Kings slows down, when the book of Kings zooms in on the reign of a single king, it's so important to pay attention, because this king then helps us to see and to make sense of all of the others. The critiques, the specific judgments about what Ahab is doing tunes us into the things that other kings are also doing. And so what we heard Whitney and Becca reading for us this morning is just a snapshot of Ahab's evil, and we're supposed to extrapolate and assume that he was doing this kind of thing on a regular basis, and not just him, but other kings were doing similar things. And what is he doing? A king looks next door and he sees a piece of property and he wants it, right? Ahab breaks one of the 10 commandments. He covets his neighbor's vineyard. But Naboth says no. 1 Kings 21, verse 3, specifically, Naboth says, Yahweh forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. And Ahab is upset. He throws a temper tantrum. He's vexed and sullen, the ESV says, and he whines and he refuses to eat because Naboth won't give him his vineyard. Right? Then Ahab's wife, Jezebel, comes in and asks, what's wrong? And Ahab tells her what Naboth has done. To which Jezebel asks an interesting question and makes an interesting promise. And I want you to notice a couple things. First, Naboth's rejection is repeated 3 times. Naboth rejects Ahab And then Ahab falls onto his bed thinking about Naboth's rejection. And then Ahab tells Jezebel about the rejection. 3 distinct occurrences of the rejection. It happens, he thinks about it, he tells about it. And then it's worth noticing how the rejection or the story of the rejection changes over time. When Naboth rejects Ahab, Naboth has a clear reason, right? To give or even to sell this property, it would be a deliberate act of disobedience toward Yahweh. Why? Well, the text tells us at the very beginning, Naboth was a Jezreelite in the land of Jezreel. This is the land that Yahweh gave to Naboth's Jezreel ancestors. And it's the land that God said would belong to Naboth's family permanently. It's not his to give away. Naboth is simply not allowed to give it away, not even to a powerful king who asks for it or demands it or offers to pay enough money for it. Naboth says no because of God and his ancestors. I love that, right? The ability to say no to pressure from outside because of who God is and the family that you belong to. I just want to pause there for just a second. And I want to put a name to what Naboth is doing. In technical terms, Naboth is living out consequential faith. Consequential faith. If you write down anything today, let it be that phrase and then go from here thinking about what consequential faith is and means and how we pass it on to the next generation. See, Naboth has a faith. His faith has specific consequences for how he lives. He has made a moral choice. And he explains it. He points to his faith in God, to a specific command from God as the reason for his choice. Parents, this is one of the central goals of parenting. We actually don't want our kids to grow up and just follow our rules. We want our kids to grow up and do specific things that they associate with the love of God and as a direct response of living in obedience to Jesus. Those are not the same thing, right? Our goal is to help our kids have consequential faith, to be able to point to specific things that they are doing on purpose in their lives, and then to be able to name how these are a direct consequence of their relationship with Jesus. Consequential faith. Let that stick with you. Naboth has it. But notice what happens in Ahab's head as he moves away from Naboth. Naboth's no, because God gave to my ancestors, becomes in Ahab's head no, because of Naboth's ancestors. God disappears. In Ahab's mind, God's command, it just doesn't register. He's either ignored or filtered out the God part, or he didn't hear it, or he's just simply not tuned into who God is and what God is doing. But regardless, Ahab shows that he isn't making sense of his world in light of Israel's God. And so in Naboth's second refusal, God drops out of the no. But then comes the third refusal, when Ahab tells his wife Jezebel about it. And in verse 6, it now becomes simply Naboth saying, I will not give you my vineyard. Which, right? If you hear Ahab say, Naboth told me, I will not give you my vineyard, that is not an accurate story, an accurate representation of what happened. God has disappeared from the equation, and now Naboth's family has dropped out. And so if you imagine hearing this from Jezebel's perspective, right? Who is Naboth? He just sounds like a stupid, stubborn, selfish guy who's like, I'm not playing with you. Right? Who is this Naboth? Like some puny civilian, a nobody, right? To reject the totally reasonable request of the king to purchase land, to sell land. Ahab told Jezebel that he had even offered to buy it or trade it. And so Jezebel responds in a way that actually you might expect any loving partner who hears this kind of story from their husband. And I mentioned earlier, right, that she asks a question and she makes a promise. And she asks her husband this: do you now govern Israel? And then she promises him, I will give you the vineyard of Naboth, the Jezreelite. Something subtle is happening here, but it is profound. And I think it has implications to challenge the way that we follow Jesus. Jezebel asks this question: do you now govern Israel? And on the one hand, right, the obvious answer is yes. I do govern Israel. I am the king. Who else governs Israel? Right? But knowing Israel's story and knowing God's law, we also know that because someone governs Israel doesn't mean they're actually free to take land that they want. In fact, a king has almost no authority whatsoever in God's law over the land. The book of Joshua already told us. Who was it who divided up the land? It was God. Who was it who decided who got which land? God. And then God said, do not steal from your neighbor. And after Israel begged God for a king, God says, I will give you a king, but I promise you, your king is going to try to steal your land. So, here's what's interesting. Jezebel asks, right? Do you now govern Israel? And while the answer could be and is assumed to be, well, yes, I do, in a real sense, the answer is actually kind of no. At least, like, not really. Why? Because Israel has only one true king. Human kings are only at most a stand-in representative, an image of the one true king. A human king actually doesn't have any real authority on their own. Only what God has given to them, and only God has the right and the authority to give land or to take it away. And so, do you now govern Israel, Ahab? Jezebel's question, it's so interesting because it actually works in the same way as the question that Jesus asked a group of people who were trying to trap him. You might remember that a group comes to him and asks him if it's right for them to pay taxes to Caesar. They were asking this question: who is our rightful ruler, Jesus? To whom do we owe our money? To whom do we owe our lives? They were hoping to get Jesus in trouble with his answer to this question. But Jesus strategically flips the question in an unexpected way, right? He pulls out a Roman coin, a coin that had an image of Caesar on it. And Jesus asks, hey, whose image is on this coin? And the people all say, Caesar's image is on the coin. And so Jesus responds, give to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's. Straightforward enough? The people, however, don't understand that he has actually made them answer the question that they were asking. And they have now revealed by their answer that they have eyes capable of seeing only what is skin deep. Right? They look at this coin, they see a human image, and they only see a human. But the deeper truth, the more ancient truth, is that they are looking at far more than a coin with Caesar's image on it. While they can only see a human, the human Caesar, if they had eyes to truly see, they would see the one whom Caesar is an image of. Caesar is not an image to himself, but an image of another. His name is Yahweh, the creator of the heavens and the earth. When Jezebel asks Ahab if he governs Israel, she's suggesting that he has authority to take land that he wants. In Jezebel's eyes, Ahab is more than an image of God. Ahab has the rights and the authority of God himself. And at the same time, Jezebel looks at Naboth, a man made in the image of God, and she sees less than an image of God. She looks at Ahab and sees more than an image of God, and she looks at Naboth and she sees less than an image of God. And when you view a human being as less than the image of God, you will begin to give yourself permission to do some of the most horrific things imaginable. Naboth has already broken the 10th commandment, coveting his neighbor's vineyard. But now Jezebel orders Naboth's neighbors to break the 9th commandment. Thanks for pointing that out, Lauren. Right? She tells them to lie about Naboth, testifying falsely against him, so that they then can, under false pretenses, murder him, breaking the 6th commandment, allowing her husband to finally break the 8th commandment, stealing from Naboth's family what God had given to them. Kings sums up Ahab's reign like this. We heard it earlier, but in verse 25 of 21, there was none who sold himself to do what was evil in the sight of Yahweh like Ahab, whom Jezebel, his wife, incited. He acted very abominably in going after images or idols, as the Amorites had done, whom Yahweh had cast out before the people of Israel. Can you hear what the book of Kings is arguing through this story? The problem isn't that Ahab and all the kings before him are evil because they're checking their daily horoscope to see if there's something interesting there. The problem is that Ahab has put his trust in the images of other gods. Ahab has begun to see himself in light of these other images. He has begun to measure himself, measure his authority, measure his rule and his worth according to these other images. He begins to imitate the values and the priorities of these other gods. He is acting like them. And the more that Ahab becomes like these other images, the less you can see the image of the one true God in him. And the more that Ahab looks like these other images, the less he is able to see the image of the one true God in his neighbors. To the other gods of the ancient world, right, some humans are better humans than others. Some humans are more deserving of dignity than others. Some humans ought to come first, and others last. At least this is how the other gods of the ancient world ordered the world they lived in. To these gods, you know who's the best human? The king human. A king deserves what he wants, what he can get. His life is the most important. His comfort, his kingdom. Everyone else comes second. And therefore, it's not a big jump to, is it really murder if you kill a guy who refuses to give you what you need to do the job that God has called you to do? When the Hebrew Bible tells us that someone was evil or wicked because they bowed down to idols, we're not being told about some private religious practices like, a person just goes to church in this one place that's kind of weird. The Hebrew Bible is making this claim that anyone who worships any god besides Yahweh will have a distorted vision of themselves and a distorted vision of their neighbors. Anyone who worships any god besides Yahweh will have a distorted vision of themselves and a distorted vision of their neighbors. Put this claim to the test as you keep reading Kings, as we read prophets later this year. This is a foundational claim in the scriptures that worshiping other gods will always and inevitably lead to injustice. That idolatry is always followed by injustice. Or so the Bible seems to claim. Enter Jesus. As much as God's people tried to see Yahweh clearly, what we discover is that the power and the pull of every other ancient god was so strong, so that even when people followed Yahweh, they still often saw him with blurry vision. Israel often treated their God as though he were just one of, or the best of, the gods of the pagans. But Jesus arrives announcing that he had come to show us clearly, to give us a clear vision of what God is really like. Jesus claims that in him we can see what the God of Israel looks like and acts like. Jesus gives us the clearest picture of Yahweh so that as we follow him, as we live as images of God, we now have a much clearer sense of what our lives are supposed to look like. And just notice, right? Notice as we read the stories of Jesus, what happens to everyone around Jesus as he is the faithful image of God. Jesus has this ability to treat everyone around him, from sinner to saint, clean and unclean, rich and poor, uneducated and educated, Jew and Gentile, all of them, right? He had the ability to treat them all as fellow human beings, worthy of love and dignity, all of them bearing the image of God. And then those who gathered around Jesus and continued to follow him, look at what they do when they begin to see the image of God clearly in themselves. They start giving away their stuff. They start sharing what they have, selling their possessions, making sure that there is nobody among them in need, making sure that orphans and widows are cared for. They make sure that wrongs have been righted within the family of God. They make sure that all are given access to God's kingdom, and they refuse to treat each other according to the honor-shame systems of their culture. This is what the Bible calls justice. Justice. When we worship God, the God of Israel, the God seen in the image of Jesus, justice follows. Justice is what we do. As we see the image of God in us and we see the image of God in our neighbors. One of the reasons Christians make the claim that Jesus is the only way. One part of what that means is that we confess, and consider this morning if you could confess this, if you believe this, that there never has been and there never will be another human who images God so perfectly as Jesus. That is until the very end, when all things have been made new. Which means, right, that if our eyes are fixed on anyone else, anyone besides Jesus, if we let any other human be the image that we are imitating, we will distort the image of God in ourselves, settling for less than what God made us for. And we will distort the image of God in others, treating our neighbors as less than what an image-bearing human deserves. And so this morning, my brothers and sisters, let's fix our eyes on Jesus, the one who perfectly images God for us, who gave his life for us and shows us what love is.